Alright, folks, settle in and get comfortable because tonight we're diving into one of the most bizarre and unsettling mysteries in literary history. We're talking about the death of Edgar Allan Poe, the master of macabre himself, the guy who wrote about premature burial, mysterious murders, and descents into madness. And here's the twisted irony: his own death was more mysterious and disturbing than anything he ever wrote. Picture this: October 3rd, 1849, Baltimore, Maryland. A man is found delirious in the gutter outside a tavern, wearing clothes that aren't his own, unable to explain how he got there or what happened to him. 4 days later, he's dead, and his last words are, "Lord, help my poor soul." The man, Edgar Allan Poe, one of America's greatest writers, dead at just 40 years old under circumstances so strange that we're still arguing about what killed him over 170 years later. Was it murder, disease, alcoholism, a kidnapping scheme, brain tumor, rabies, suicide? The theories are as dark and twisted as one of Poe's own stories. And the truth? Well, we may never know for sure, but tonight we're going to walk through everything we know about Poe's final days, examine all the theories, and try to piece together what really happened to the man who gave us The Raven, The Telltale Heart, and Nightmares for Generations. So light a candle, pour yourself a drink, Poe would approve, and let's step back into 1849 Baltimore to solve a mystery that's haunted literary historians for over a century and a half. Part 1: The Man Behind the Mystery. Before we get to the weird circumstances of Poe's death, we need to understand who Edgar Allan Poe actually was, because his life was almost as tragic and dark as his stories. This wasn't a guy who just wrote about horror for kicks. He lived through stuff that would break most people. Edgar Poe was born in Boston in January 1809 to a pair of traveling actors, which in early 19th century America was basically one step above being circus folk in terms of social respectability. His parents, David and Elizabeth Poe, were both performers, which meant young Edgar spent his earliest years backstage in theaters, surrounded by drama, performance, and pretense. But the theatrical world of his childhood came crashing down when he was barely old enough to remember it. His father abandoned the family when Edgar was about a year old, just up and left, never to be heard from again. Then, when Edgar was not quite 3 years old, his mother Elizabeth died of tuberculosis in Richmond, Virginia. Now, here's where it gets really dark. Little Edgar was there when his mother died, watched this young woman, she was only 24-year-old, waste away from consumption, coughing blood, growing weaker and paler every day, until finally she was gone. Imagine being a toddler and having that be one of your earliest memories, your mother dying slowly and painfully while you're too young to understand what's happening. This experience scarred Poe for life. If you've ever read his work, you'll notice that he's absolutely obsessed with beautiful young women dying, especially from disease. The death of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetical topic in the world, he once wrote. That's not just a literary observation, that's trauma speaking. After his mother's death, Edgar was taken in, but never legally adopted, by John and Frances Allan, a wealthy tobacco merchant, and his wife in Richmond. They gave him the middle name Allan, which is why he's Edgar Allan Poe instead of just Edgar Poe. John Allan was, well, let's just say he wasn't winning any Father of the Year awards. He was cold, demanding, and seemed to view Edgar more as a project than a son. He'd alternate between indulging the kid with expensive education and then cutting him off financially when Edgar didn't live up to his expectations. It was this constant push and pull dynamic that left Poe always feeling like he was on unstable ground. Frances Allen, on the other hand, genuinely loved Edgar and doted on him. But guess what? She also died of tuberculosis when Poe was in his early 20s. So that's another beloved mother figure, gone the same way as his birth mother. The universe really seemed to have it out for this guy. In 1826, Poe enrolled in the University of Virginia, which had just been founded by Thomas Jefferson a year earlier. He was apparently a brilliant student, excelling in languages and literature. But here's where we start seeing the patterns that would define and ultimately end his life. John Allen gave Poe less money than he needed for expenses, which meant Edgar had to try to make up the difference somehow. He turned to gambling, and like many young guys who turn to gambling to solve money problems, he ended up way worse off than when he started. Within a year, he racked up about $2,000 in gambling debts. That's roughly 50,000 in today's money. He also started drinking heavily during this period. Now, this is important to understand. Poe was not your typical heavy drinker. Multiple people who knew him said that he couldn't handle alcohol at all. Even one or two drinks would affect him dramatically, making him aggressive, incoherent, or sick. But despite this obvious alcohol intolerance, he kept drinking throughout his life, especially during times of stress or grief. When John Allen found out about the gambling debts and the drinking, he refused to pay and pulled Poe out of university after just 1 year. This pattern, Poe screwing up, Allen refusing to help, Poe ending up in desperate circumstances, would repeat itself throughout their whole relationship. In 1827, desperate and broke, Poe enlisted in the army under a fake name. He called himself Edgar A. Perry and claimed to be 22 when he was actually 18. He actually did pretty well in the military, rising to the rank of sergeant major, which was the highest enlisted rank possible. During this time, he also published the first book of poetry, Tamburlaine and Other Poems, under the anonymous byline A Bostonian. The book went absolutely nowhere, only about 50 copies were printed, and basically nobody read it. Today, original copies are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, which is the kind of irony Poe would have appreciated. After 2 years in the army, Poe reconciled somewhat with John Allen, who agreed to help him get an appointment to West Point Military Academy. But by this point, Frances Allen had died, John Allen had remarried, and it was clear that Edgar was no longer going to be Allen's heir. Poe basically sabotaged his West Point career on purpose, getting himself court-martialed for gross neglect of duty and disobedience of orders. He was kicked out of West Point in 1831, and John Allen basically disowned him. At 22 years old, Poe was completely on his own with no money, no family support, and no real prospects. The 1830s and 1840s were when Poe really came into his own as a writer, but they were also marked by constant financial struggle. The guy was a literary genius, but genius doesn't pay the bills, especially not in the 19th century America, where there were no copyright protections and writers got paid pennies for their work. Poe bounced around between various cities, Baltimore, Richmond, Philadelphia, New York, working as an editor for different magazines and journals. He was actually a brilliant editor and critic, but he made enemies easily. He'd write these savage reviews, tearing apart other writers' work, which made him respected but not exactly beloved in literary circles. His own writing was starting to gain attention, though. In 1835, he published Berenice, a grotesque horror story about a man who becomes obsessed with his cousin's teeth. In 1838, he published Ligeia, about a man whose dead wife comes back to possess the body of the second wife. In 1839, The Fall of the House of Usher came out, cementing his reputation as America's premier horror writer. But here's the thing about being a pioneering horror writer in the 1840s. It didn't make you rich. Poe was consistently broke, constantly moving, constantly struggling to make ends meet. He'd write these masterpieces and get paid maybe $9 or $10 for them. The Raven, which became his most famous poem and made him a literary celebrity, earned him a grand total of $9. In 1835, when Poe was 27 years old, he married his 13-year-old first cousin, Virginia Clem. Now, before we get too judgy about this, we need to understand that cousin marriage was not uncommon in this era. And while 13 seems shockingly young to us, the age of consent was much lower in the 19th century. That said, yeah, it's definitely unsettling by modern standards. By all accounts, Poe genuinely loved Virginia, and she loved him. She was apparently sweet-natured, musical, and devoted to her older husband. For about 6 years, despite their poverty, they seem to have been relatively happy together. But then, in January 1842, everything changed. Virginia was singing at the piano when a blood vessel burst in her throat. She started hemorrhaging, blood pouring from her mouth, and Poe realized with horror what was happening. She had tuberculosis, the same disease that had killed both his mothers. Virginia lingered for 5 agonizing years. She'd have periods where she seemed to be getting better, then she'd relapse and come close to death again. Poe watched the woman he loved slowly wasting away, coughing blood, growing thinner and paler, just like his mother had when he was a child. During these years, Poe's drinking got worse. His work became even darker. This is when he wrote The Mask of the Red Death, about a plague that kills everyone despite their attempts to escape it. He became increasingly unstable, suffering from what we'd probably now recognize as depression and anxiety. Virginia finally died on January 30, 1847. She was 24 years old, the same age as Poe's mother had been when she died. Poe was absolutely devastated. Friends said he lay on her grave in the winter cold, unable to accept that she was gone. After Virginia's death, Poe kind of fell apart. He continued writing and even produced some of his best work during this period, including Eureka, his cosmology prose poem, and Annabel Lee, his hauntingly beautiful final poem. But personally, he was a mess. He became involved in a series of strange, intense relationships with different women. He got engaged to a wealthy widow called Sarah Elmira Royster, actually his childhood sweetheart, then seemed to be pursuing a poet named Sarah Anna Lewis. Then there was another woman named Annie Richmond, who he seemed obsessed with. It was like he was desperately trying to replace Virginia, but couldn't commit to anyone. His drinking escalated. He'd go on binges that would leave him sick for days. He'd disappear for periods of time and turn up in strange places with no memory of how he got there. His behavior became increasingly erratic and unreliable. Multiple friends and acquaintances from this period described Poe as seeming unwell, not just drunk, but genuinely physically and mentally ill. He complained of memory problems, depression, and strange physical symptoms. Somehow, and something was clearly very wrong with him, beyond just grief and alcoholism. By the fall of 1849, Poe seemed to be trying to pull his life together. He had reconciled with Elmira Royster and they were planning to marry. He had stopped drinking, or so he claimed. He was making plans for his own magazine. Things seemed like might be looking up. And then came his trip to Baltimore, and everything went to hell. Part 2, The Final Journey, What We Know for Sure. Alright, now we're getting into the actual mystery. Let's walk through what we know for certain about Poe's final days before we dive into all the wild theories about what killed him. On September 27, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe left Richmond, Virginia, where he'd been staying with his fiancée Elmira Royster. He was supposedly heading to New York to handle some business matters, then planning to return to Richmond to finalize wedding plans. Several people saw Poe off that day, and they later reported that he seemed cheerful and sober. He was dressed nicely in a suit and was carrying a trunk with his belongings. He took a steamboat from Richmond to Baltimore, where he planned to catch a connecting train to Philadelphia and then on to New York. Here's the weird thing: Poe apparently had about $1,500 in cash on him, roughly $50,000 in today's money, which was a lot of money for him to be carrying around. This was payment for some lectures he'd been giving, and possibly in advance for editing work he was going to do. This detail becomes important later. The steamboat arrived in Baltimore on September 28th, and then nothing. Poe vanishes from the historical record for nearly a week. What happened to Edgar Allan Poe between September 28th and October 3rd? Nobody knows. This is the black hole at the center of the mystery, the missing piece that would solve everything if we could just figure it out. There are a few scattered and confirmed sightings. Some people claim they saw someone who might have been Poe in Philadelphia, which doesn't make sense because that's where he was supposed to be going. But if he was there, why didn't he contact anyone or conduct his business? One person said they might have seen him on a train between Baltimore and Philadelphia, looking disheveled and confused. Another claimed to have seen somebody resembling Poe at a Baltimore tavern, drinking heavily. But all of this is uncertain. Nobody who actually knew Poe well reported seeing him during these days. He didn't write any letters, didn't show up at any expected destinations, didn't contact his fiancée or friends. He just disappeared. What we do know is that at some point during these lost days, Poe lost or was separated from his trunk containing his belongings and that $1,500. He ended up wearing somebody else's clothes, shabby, ill fitting clothes that weren't his own, and he ended up delirious on the streets of Baltimore. On the afternoon of October the 3rd, 1849, a printer named Joseph W. Walker was passing by a tavern called Gunner's Hall, also known as Ryan's Fourth Ward Polls, on Lombard Street in Baltimore. This building was being used as a polling place because October the 3rd was election day in Baltimore. Walker spotted a man lying in the gutter outside the tavern, and he immediately recognized him. It was Edgar Allan Poe, except it wasn't quite the Poe he knew. The man was wearing a cheap, tattered suit that was way too big for him. He had on a palm leaf that was falling apart. His clothes were dirty and torn. He was semi-conscious, unable to stand or speak coherently. Walker would later describe him as being in a state of stupor or delirium. Walker was alarmed enough that he immediately sent a note to the doctor named Joseph Snodgrass, who was an acquaintance of Poe's. The note read, "Dear Sir, there is a gentleman rather the worse for wear at Ryan's Fourth Ward Polls, who goes under the cognomen of Edgar A. Poe, and who appears in great distress. He says he is acquainted with you, and I assure you he is in need of immediate assistance." That phrase, rather the worse for wear, is one hell of an understatement, as we'll see. When Dr. Snodgrass arrived at Gunner's Hall, he was shocked by what he found. This wasn't the Edgar Allan Poe he knew, the sharp, well-dressed writer and editor. This was a broken man who could barely speak or move. Poe was conscious, but only barely. He could recognize Snodgrass and respond to simple questions, but his answers didn't make sense. When asked what happened to him, he couldn't explain. When asked where his trunk and belongings were, he didn't know. He couldn't say how he'd ended up at this tavern or how long he'd been there. Snodgrass and Walker got Poe into a carriage and took him to Washington College Hospital, now part of Church Hospital. He was admitted under the care of Dr. John Joseph Moran, who would be the primary witness to Poe's final days. At the hospital, they took off those strange, ill fitting clothes and put Poe in a bed in a special room reserved for patients with delirium tremens, basically a padded cell for people going through severe alcohol withdrawal or suffering from mental disturbances. What happened during Poe's 4 days in the hospital is known to us primarily through Dr. Moran's account, though Moran's credibility has been questioned because he changed some details over the years and may have embellished parts of the story. According to Moran, Poe spent most of these 4 days in a state of delirium. He would alternate between periods of unconsciousness and periods of wild, frantic activity. When he was conscious, he would talk frantically to invisible people, calling out names that nobody recognized. He had violent tremors and seemed to be in considerable distress. Moran said that Poe kept calling out for someone named Reynolds over and over again. To this day, nobody knows who Reynolds was. Poe knew several people with that last name, but none of them seemed to be in Baltimore or have any connection to his final days. This mysterious Reynolds haunted Poe's fevered mind until almost the very end. On the night of October the 6th, Poe seemed to calm down somewhat. He became more lucid and could speak somewhat coherently, though he still couldn't explain what had happened to him. Moran tried to ask him about his family, about who should be contacted, about what had happened during those lost days. Poe couldn't or wouldn't answer. He just kept saying variations of, "The best thing a friend could do would be to blow out my brains with a pistol." Early in the morning of October 7, 1849, Poe began to fail rapidly. The tremors got worse. His breathing became labored. Around 3 a.m., he began repeating a single phrase over and over. "Lord, help my poor soul. Lord, help my poor soul." At 5 a.m. on October 7, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe died. He was 40 years old. Here is where things get even weirder. You'd think that when a famous writer dies under mysterious circumstances, there would be a thorough investigation, a detailed autopsy, a clear records of what happened. But nope, not in 1849 Baltimore. There was no autopsy performed on Poe's body. The official cause of death on his death certificate was listed simply as congestion of the brain, which is basically Victorian medical speak for "we have no idea." It was a catch-all diagnosis that could mean anything from a stroke to alcohol poisoning to meningitis to a brain tumor. Poe's medical records from the hospital have been lost. Dr. Moran's account are the only real source we have, and he wrote them years after the fact, and they're inconsistent in some details. The clothes Poe was found in were never identified or traced. Nobody ever figured out whose clothes they were or how Poe ended up wearing them. The trunk with Poe's belongings and that 1,500 in cash, never found, just vanished into thin air. Nobody came forward to explain where Poe had been during those lost days between September 28th and October the 3rd. No innkeeper said, "Oh yeah, he stayed at my place." No bartender said, "He was drinking at my tavern." No police officer said, "I saw him wandering the streets." It's like he fell into a black hole for nearly a week. Poe was buried quickly, just 2 days after his death. in an unmarked grave in Westminster Presbyterian Church Cemetery in Baltimore. Only about a dozen people attended the funeral, which was conducted by a minister who didn't even know Poe and mispronounced his name during the service. The whole thing took about 3 minutes. For years, his grave was unmarked and his exact burial spot was uncertain. It wasn't until 1875, so 26 years after his death, that fans raised money for a proper monument. When they moved his remains to a more prominent spot in the cemetery, they found that his coffin had partially collapsed, and Poe's skull was reportedly still in good condition, with his brain allegedly having solidified into a hard mass. Though this claim is probably exaggerated or false, it added even more Gothic mystery to the whole affair. So so that's what we know for sure. Poe left Richmond healthy and sober on September 27th. He vanished for 5 days. He was found delirious and wearing someone else's clothes on October the 3rd. He died 4 days later after suffering from severe tremors, delirium, and physical distress, and nobody could say what had actually killed him. For over 170 years, people have been trying to solve this mystery. Let's look at all the major theories. Part 3: The Theories. What really killed Edgar Allan Poe? Alright, here's where we get into the really interesting stuff. Over the years, everyone, from doctors to historians to amateur sleuths, have put forward theories about what killed Poe. Some are plausible, some are wild, and some are downright bizarre. Let's go through them from most to least likely. Theory number 1: alcohol poisoning, delirium tremens. This is the oldest and most traditional explanation, and honestly, it's probably what most people assume killed Poe. The guy was known to have drinking problems. He was found in a gutter outside a tavern, and he died showing symptoms consistent with severe alcohol withdrawal. Case closed, right? Well, maybe. Let's look at the evidence for this theory. Evidence for alcohol. Poe had a well-documented history of alcohol abuse. He had unusually low tolerance for alcohol and would get violently drunk from small amounts. He was found outside a tavern on election day. More on why that matters in a minute. Dr. Moran initially believed Poe was suffering from delirium tremens. The tremors, delirium, and agitation are all consistent with severe alcohol withdrawal. Dr. Snodgrass, who found Poe, was a temperance advocate who spent years claiming Poe died from drinking as a cautionary tale. Evidence against alcohol. Multiple people who saw him before he left Richmond said he had been sober and was committed to staying sober for his upcoming marriage. Poe had joined a temperance society and reportedly hadn't had a drink in months. No one actually saw him drinking during those lost days. It's all speculation. Poe's symptoms weren't quite typical for alcohol poisoning or DT. If he had been on a week-long bender, someone would have seen him or remembered him. And lastly, Dr. Moran later said he didn't actually smell alcohol on Poe and that the symptoms were unusual. The alcohol theory is plausible, but it has some problems. Poe had been drunk plenty of times before and hadn't died from it. What was the difference this time? And why was he wearing someone else's clothes? And where was his money? Some historians think Poe might have had a single drink that triggered a massive reaction due to his alcohol intolerance, possibly combined with some other underlying condition, but it doesn't fully explain everything we know about his final days. Theory number 2: cooping, election fraud. Now, this is where things get interesting and dark. This theory suggests that Poe was a victim of cooping, which was a form of election fraud that was rampant in the 19th century Baltimore. Here's how cooping worked. Political gangs would kidnap men off the streets, hold them in a room called a coop, get them drunk or drug them, sometimes beat them, then force them to vote multiple times at different polling locations. They'd make the victims change clothes between votes so poll workers wouldn't recognize them. Remember, Poe was found outside a polling place on election day, wearing clothes that weren't his own. That's not a coincidence. So, evidence for cooping. Poe was found at a polling place on election day. That's suspicious timing. He was wearing cheap, ill fitting clothes that clearly weren't his. Classic sign of cooping. His own clothes and money had vanished. Baltimore was notorious for cooping gangs, and the area where Poe was found was known for it. The fourth ward where Poe was found was run by a political gang. Cooping victims were often given alcohol or drugs, beaten, and held for several days, matching Poe's timeline. Victims of cooping sometimes died from the beating, drugging, and forced drinking. Evidence against cooping. No direct evidence exists. Nobody ever came forward to confess or testify. Poe was reasonably well known in Baltimore. Wouldn't someone have recognized him? Cooping victims were usually homeless men or transients, not middle aged writers. Why would they target someone like Poe specifically? This theory is actually pretty compelling. It explains the clothes, the lost days, the delirium, the location where he was found, and why he couldn't explain what happened. Cooping was a real thing that really killed people in the 1849 Baltimore. The main problem with this theory is lack of evidence. Nobody ever admitted to it, and we have no documentation. But the circumstantial evidence is strong enough that many historians consider this one of the most plausible explanations. Theory number 3, rabies. In 1996, a cardiologist named Dr. R. Michael Benitez revived the symptoms that Dr. Moran described and came to a surprising conclusion. Edgar Allan Poe died of rabies. This theory got a lot of attention because it's both medical and unexpected. Let's look at the reasoning. Evidence for rabies. Poe's symptoms matched rabies almost perfectly: confusion, aggression, difficulty swallowing, hydrophobia, fear of water, hallucinations, periods of calm followed by agitation. Dr. Moran noted that Poe refused to drink water and seemed afraid of it, classic rabies symptom. Rabies can incubate for months before symptoms appear, so Poe could have been bitten weeks or months earlier. Once symptoms appear, death usually occurs within days, matching Poe's timeline. Rabies was common in mid-19th century America. There is no record of Poe being vaccinated against rabies, because vaccines didn't really exist yet. Rabies can cause delirium, aggression, and the kind of symptoms Poe displayed. Evidence against rabies. No one ever reported Poe being bitten by an animal. Rabies typically causes extreme fever, and Poe's temperature wasn't noted as being especially high. Rabies victims usually have trouble talking, and Poe was able to speak throughout his illness. The timeline might not really match. Rabies symptoms usually appear faster than this, and then some of the symptoms don't quite fit. The rabies theory is fascinating and has gained a lot of traction in recent years. Dr. Benitez made a compelling case that Poe's symptom profile matches rabies better than alcohol poisoning or anything else. However, other doctors have pushed back, saying the symptoms aren't a perfect match, and that rabies don't explain the missing days or the changed clothes. It's a good theory, but it's not definitive. Theory number 4, brain tumor or lesion. Some medical experts have suggested that Poe might have been suffering from a brain tumor or some other kind of brain lesion that would explain both his behavioral changes in the months before his death and his final symptoms. Evidence for brain tumor. Poe's behavior in the months before his death was increasingly erratic. He complained of memory problems and confusion. Brain tumors can cause personality changes, aggression, confusion, and seizures. A brain tumor could cause the delirium and physical symptoms Moran described. When Poe's grave was moved in 1875, there were reports that his brain had turned to stone or hardened, which could indicate calcification from a tumor, though this claim is probably exaggerated. Evidence against brain tumor. Without an autopsy or modern imaging, we can't confirm this. Brain tumors usually kill more slowly than this, and it doesn't explain the missing days, changed clothes, or circumstances of finding him. This theory is medically plausible but ultimately unprovable. We'd need modern forensic analysis of Poe's remains to confirm it, and that's never gonna happen. Theory number 5: murder. Some people think Poe was murdered, and honestly, the circumstances are suspicious enough that we can't rule it out. Possible murder scenarios. Scenario A: murdered by Elmira's brothers. Elmira Royster's brothers supposedly didn't approve of her remarrying Poe. Some theorists suggest that they had him killed or beaten up to prevent the marriage. This explains the violence, the lost days, and the circumstances, but there is zero evidence for it. Scenario B: robbed and beaten. Poe had a lot of cash on him. Maybe someone found out, robbed him, beat him, and left him to die. The changed clothes could be from the attackers, but again, no evidence, and why would robbers change his clothes? Scenario C: political murder. Some wild theories suggest Poe was killed for political reasons, maybe because of something he wrote or someone he knew. This is pretty far-fetched. Evidence against murder. No wounds or signs of violence were noted on Poe's body. No one was ever accused or suspected. No motive that makes sense. Dr. Moran never suggested murder. Murder is possible but unlikely. The circumstances are suspicious, but there is no real evidence of foul play beyond speculation. Theory number 6: carbon monoxide poisoning. This is a more recent theory that suggests Poe might have been exposed to carbon monoxide, probably from a faulty stove or poor ventilation wherever he was staying during those lost days. Evidence for carbon monoxide. Symptoms match: confusion, nausea, weakness, delirium. Would explain the sudden onset of symptoms. Common danger in the 19th century buildings with poor ventilation. Could cause the kind of brain damage that led to his death. Evidence against carbon monoxide. Pure speculation with no evidence. Doesn't explain the clothes or lost money. Other people would have been affected too. This theory is medically possible but has no real support beyond speculation. Theory number 7: suicide. Some people think that Poe killed himself, possibly by drinking poison or taking some kind of drug overdose. Evidence for suicide. Poe was deeply depressed after Virginia's death. He had talked about death and seemed fatalistic. He told Dr. Moran that a friend should blow out his brains. His financial situation was desperate, multiple failed relationships and rejections. Evidence against suicide. He was engaged to be married and seemed to be looking forward to it. He had made plans for the future, including starting a magazine. His symptoms don't match any common poison. He seemed confused about what happened to him, not purposeful. Suicide doesn't explain the changed clothes or missing money. Suicide seems unlikely given the circumstances and Poe's apparent plans for the future. Theory number 8: diabetes or hypoglycemia. Some medical professionals have suggested that Poe might have had diabetes or experienced a severe hypoglycemic episode. Evidence for diabetes could explain delirium and confusion, might explain the erratic behavior, could cause the physical symptoms. Evidence against. No history of diabetes symptoms. Doesn't explain most of the circumstances. Symptoms don't quite match. This is a possible explanation, but doesn't explain enough to be a leading theory. Theory number 9: enzyme deficiency. An interesting medical theory suggests that Poe might have had a generic enzyme deficiency that affected how his body processed alcohol. This could explain why even small amounts of alcohol affected him so severely. Evidence for enzyme deficiency would explain his extreme alcohol intolerance, could cause symptoms like his were, would explain why one drink could kill him when he'd survived drinking before. Evidence against can't be proven without genetic testing, still doesn't explain the full circumstances. This theory has some medical merit but remains speculative. Theory number 10, combination of factors. Honestly, the most likely explanation is that Poe died from a combination of factors. Maybe he was the victim of cooping, was beaten and forced to drink. This triggered some underlying medical condition, brain lesion, rabies, or something else. And his weakened state from grief, malnutrition, and stress made him unable to recover. The human body is complicated, and death is often multifactorial. Poe might have been teetering on the edge for months, and whatever happened during these lost days pushed him over. Part 4, the Lost Masterpiece Theory. There is one more theory I want to mention, though it's less about how Poe died and more about what he might have been doing during these lost days. Some literary scholars have speculated that Poe might have been working on a new piece of writing, possibly his masterpiece, and that the manuscript was lost when he lost his trunk. Think about it. Poe was a writer. Writing was how he processed trauma and emotion. He'd just lost the love of his life, was about to remarry, and was supposedly getting his life together. What if he was working on something new, something that reflected on his life, his losses, his hopes for the future? We know that the trunk went missing. We know Poe was carrying papers and documents. What if among these papers was a manuscript, maybe a novel, maybe a long poem, or maybe an autobiography that would have been his greatest work? This is a pure speculation, of course. There is no evidence that such a manuscript existed, but it's a romantic notion that appeals to literary historians, the idea that Poe's true masterpiece was lost in those final mysterious days, and that we'll never know what brilliance died with him. It would be fitting, wouldn't it? The master of dark mystery, leaving behind one final unsolvable mystery. Part 5, The Man in Context, Understanding Poe's World. To really understand what might have happened to Poe, we need to understand what life was like in 1849 Baltimore. This wasn't the safe, organized world we live in today. This was a city where violence was common, political corruption was rampant, and death was always close in hand. Mid-19th century Baltimore was rough, really rough. The city was growing rapidly, filled with immigrants, sailors, laborers, and all the criminal elements that followed them. The police force was small and often corrupt. Political gangs essentially controlled neighborhoods, and violence during those elections was not just common, it was expected. The Fourth Ward, where Poe was found, was particularly notorious. It was controlled by a political gang, and the area around Gunners Hall was known for violence, drinking, and all manner of legal activity. This was not a place you wanted to end up if you were vulnerable. Street crime was rampant. Robbery, assault, and even murder were common enough that they often didn't even make the newspapers unless the victim was particularly prominent or the crime was especially heinous. A man could disappear in Baltimore for days and nobody would think much of it. The medical care was also primitive by our standards. Dr. Moran was probably a decent doctor for his time, but 1849 medicine was more guesswork than science. They didn't understand infection, viruses, or most of what actually kills people. Congestion of the brain was basically an admission that they had no idea what was wrong. Alcohol was everywhere in 1849 America, and alcoholism was epidemic. People drank because water was often unsafe. They drank to cope with hard lives and harder losses. They drank because there wasn't much else to do for entertainment. But here's the thing, even by the standards of the time, Poe's relationship with alcohol was recognized as problematic. Friends and colleagues repeatedly noted that he couldn't handle drink, that even small amounts would make him sick or violent or incoherent. This wasn't moral weakness or lack of willpower. Poe almost certainly had some kind of alcohol intolerance, probably a genetic condition that affected how his body metabolized alcohol. In modern terms, he might have had alcohol flush reaction or some kind of enzyme deficiency that made alcohol toxic to him, even in small doses. The tragedy is that despite knowing this about himself, despite seeing how alcohol destroyed his career and relationships repeatedly, Poe kept drinking. That's addiction. That's self medication for trauma and depression. That's a man trying to numb unbearable pain the only way he knew how. Let's talk about money, because Poe's financial desperation is crucial to understanding his final days. Being a writer in 1849 America was basically a starvation profession unless you were independently wealthy, which Poe was not. There was no copyright protection that actually meant anything. Publishers would pirate each other's work without paying the authors. Magazines would publish your stories and poems and pay you a pittance or nothing at all. Even when Poe was at the height of his fame, he was constantly broke. The Raven, which made him famous and is still one of the most recognizable poems in English, earned him $9. That's it, $9 for a work that had been anthologized, studied, parodied, and referenced for nearly 2 centuries. Poe spent his entire adult life scrambling for money, taking editing jobs that didn't pay enough, writing constantly but never earning enough to be financially secure. He had to beg, borrow, and sometimes literally go without food to survive. This chronic financial stress took a toll. It contributed to his drinking, his mental health problems, and his increasingly erratic behavior. When you're constantly worried about where your next meal is coming from, your brain literally cannot function properly. You're in survival mode all the time. So when Poe left Richmond with $1,500 in cash, more money than he'd probably ever had at one time in his adult life, it was both a hope for a better future and a massive temptation for anyone who might have known he had it. We can't understand Poe's death without understanding the accumulated trauma he'd experienced. By the age 40, he had lost his mother to tuberculosis at age 3, been abandoned by his father, lost his foster mother to tuberculosis, been essentially disowned by his foster father, watched his wife slowly die of tuberculosis over 5 years, experienced chronic poverty and financial insecurity, dealt with alcoholism and probable mental health issues, faced constant rejection and criticism despite his brilliance. That's a lot of pain for one person to carry. Modern psychology recognizes that accumulated trauma changes your brain, affects your decision making, and makes you more vulnerable to further harm. Poe was walking around with what would now probably diagnose as complex PTSD, major depression, and an alcohol use disorder. He was trying to build a new life, but he was doing it while carrying this enormous weight of past pain. When you understand this context, his death becomes less mysterious in some ways. This was a man who was hanging on by a thread, and something, whether it was violence, cooping, disease, or his own self destructive tendencies, finally broke that thread. Part 6: The Literary Legacy: How Death Shaped the Legend. Poe's mysterious death did something interesting. It cemented his legend in a way that a peaceful death in old age never could have. The mystery, the tragedy, the darkness of it all, it was like something out of one of his own stories. In the days and weeks after Poe's death, the literary world had mixed reactions. Some mourned him as a genius taken too soon. Others used his death as an opportunity to settle old scores. The worst offender was Rufus Griswold, who had been Poe's literary rival and was named inexplicably as his literary executor. Griswold wrote a scathing obituary that painted Poe as a depraved, drunken madman with no morals and few talents. He then published a biographical memoir that was full of lies, distortions, and even forged letters meant to make Poe look as bad as possible. Why did Griswold do this? Partly because Poe had written harsh reviews of Griswold's work, and Griswold wanted revenge. Partly because controversy sells books and Griswold stood to profit from Poe's complete works, and partly because Griswold was just kind of a terrible person. The tragedy is that for decades, Griswold's version of Poe was the accepted one. People thought Poe had been this degenerate drunk who wrote horror stories because he was himself horrible. It took years of work by Poe's defenders to rehabilitate his reputation and show that he was actually a dedicated craftsman, a loving husband, and a man who struggled with illness rather than moral failing. Over time, Poe's mysterious death became part of his romantic legend. Here was the master of the macabre, dying under mysterious and dark circumstances at the height of his powers. It was almost too perfect, too literary. Speaking of mysteries, we can't talk about Poe's death without mentioning the Poe toaster, one of the strangest traditions in literary history. Starting in 1949, so the 100th anniversary of Poe's death, a mysterious figure began visiting Poe's grave in the early morning hours of January 19th, Poe's birthday. This person, always dressed in black with their face covered, would leave 3 roses and a half bottle of cognac at the grave, toast Poe silently, and then disappear into the night. This happened every year for decades. The Poe toaster, or possibly multiple toasters over the years, never revealed their identity, never spoke to anyone, never explained why they did it. Fans and journalists would gather to watch, but the toaster remained anonymous. The tradition apparently passed from father to son at some point. There was a note left in 1999 that said, "The torch will be passed," suggesting it was a family tradition spanning generations. The visits stopped in 2009, or maybe the toaster just got better at avoiding the crowds. Either way, it's another layer of mystery on top of the original mystery, and it shows how Poe's death continues to fascinate people nearly 2 centuries later. Part 7: Modern Investigation. Can we ever know? In recent years, various people have tried to solve the mystery of Poe's death using modern methods. Let's look at some of these attempts and why they haven't given us a definitive answer. Multiple doctors and medical researchers have reviewed the historical accounts of Poe's symptoms and tried to diagnose what killed him. The problem is that we're working from incomplete second-hand accounts written by a doctor who was working with 1849 medical knowledge and who sometimes changed the story. Dr. Moran's descriptions of Poe's symptoms are frustratingly vague in some places and oddly specific in others. He talks about delirium and tremors, but he doesn't describe them in the kind of clinical detail that would help modern doctors make a diagnosis. Different medical professionals have reached different conclusions based on the same evidence. Some say alcohol withdrawal, some say rabies, some say brain tumor, some say carbon monoxide poisoning. Some say it could be any of the several conditions. Without an autopsy at the time of death and without any preserved tissue samples that could be tested with modern methods, we're basically just guessing. Historians have combed through newspaper archives, personal letters, municipal records, and every other source they can find, looking for some clue about what happened during those lost days. They've found not much. Some people have suggested exhuming Poe's remains and doing modern forensic analysis, DNA testing, toxicology, examination of bone and hair for evidence of poisoning or disease. The problem is that Poe has been dead for 175 years. His body was buried in 1849, exhumed and moved in 1875, and had been lying in the ground ever since. The likelihood of finding preserved tissue that could be meaningfully tested is pretty much zero. Plus, there is ethical question. Do we really have the right to disturb someone's grave just to satisfy our curiosity? Poe never consented to being exhumed and analyzed. Many people argue we should let him rest in peace. Part 8, the final analysis. What probably happened? Alright, we've looked at all the theories, all the evidence, all the context. Now let me give you my personal opinion on what most likely happened to Edgar Allan Poe. I think the cooping theory is the most compelling explanation for the circumstances of his death, but I don't think cooping alone killed him. I think it was a combination of factors that came together in the worst possible way. Here's my best guess at what happened. The reconstruction. Poe arrives in Baltimore on September 28th with $1,500 in cash and plans to continue in Philadelphia. He's supposed to meet with people there about business matters. For some reason, maybe he decides to visit someone in Baltimore, maybe he goes to a tavern for a meal and a drink, maybe he just gets delayed. He doesn't leave Baltimore right away. At some point, he's spotted by a cooping gang. Maybe they know who he is, maybe they don't, but they definitely notice that he is well dressed and probably has money. They grab him off the street, knock him out, and take him to a coop, probably some back room in a tavern or a basement somewhere in the Fourth Ward. They keep him there for several days, probably from September 28th or 29th throughout October the 2nd or early October the 3rd. During this time, they take his clothes, his trunk, and his money. They give him alcohol or drugs to keep him compliant. They might beat him up to keep him under control. They force him to put on the shabby clothes. On October the 3rd, election day, they take him to various polling places to vote multiple times. By this point, Poe is in bad shape. He'd been held captive for days, drugged or drunk, possibly beaten, definitely traumatized. But here's where it gets worse. Poe isn't a healthy 25-year-old who can bounce back from a few days of abuse. He is a 40-year-old man with probable alcohol intolerance, possible underlying health issues, maybe a brain lesion or a tumor, maybe undiagnosed rabies, maybe something else, and a body weakened by years of poverty, stress, and grief. The combination of forced drinking, drugs, physical abuse, and exposure to too much for his system. His body starts to shut down. The cooping gang realizes he's dying and they dump him outside Gunner's Hole, probably figuring he's some drunk who wouldn't be missed. But Poe is recognized, taken to the hospital, and spends 4 days dying as his body fails from some combination of alcohol poisoning, drug overdose, physical trauma, and underlying medical conditions. The tremors, delirium, and other symptoms Dr. Moran described could be explained by any number of things: withdrawal from alcohol or drugs, brain damage from beating or poisoning, an underlying condition like rabies, or a brain tumor that was exacerbated by the trauma. It's not a perfect explanation, and I can't prove any of it, but it fits the facts better than any single cause theory. Part 9, the unanswered questions. Even if my theory about cooping is correct, there are still so many questions that we'll never have answers to. Who was Reynolds? Poe kept calling out for Reynolds. Who was Reynolds? He kept calling out for Reynolds during his final days. Who was this person? Was it someone from the cooping gang? A friend he was trying to reach? A character from a story he was working on? A hallucination? We'll never know. We'll never know. What happened to his trunk and papers? Was there a manuscript in that trunk? Important letters, personal items that would have told us more about his final days. Did the cooping gang just throw it all away, or did they sell it, or did it end up in someone's attic, lost to history? Did anyone try to find him? Elmira Royster was waiting for him to return to Richmond. His business associates were expecting him in Philadelphia and New York. When he didn't show up, did anyone try to find him? Did anyone realize that he was missing? Or did everyone just assume he'd gone on one of his binges and would turn up eventually? There's one last thing I want to mention, and it's something that gives me chills every time I think about it. In 1848, a year before his death, Poe published a short story called Hop Frog. It's about a jester who takes revenge on his tormentors by dressing them in costumes and burning them alive. The story ends with the jester escaping for a skylight while his victims burn below. The last line of the story is: "It is supposed that Hop Frog, in company with the 8 chained orangutans, effected their escape to their own country, for neither of them was seen again." A year later, Poe himself would vanish for several days, appear briefly in changed clothes at a mysterious location, and then die without anyone knowing exactly what happened to him. Like Hopfrog, he was never seen again, at least not as the man he'd been. Did Poe somehow sense his own fate? Was the story a premonition of his own mysterious disappearance? He wrote in Annabel Lee, his last complete poem: "For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee, and the stars never rise but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so all the night tide I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in her sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea." So that's the story of Edgar Allan Poe's mysterious death, or at least it's as much of the story as we can piece together from the fragments of evidence that remain. What do you think happened? Do you buy the cooping theory? Do you think it was rabies or alcohol or murder or some combination of factors we haven't even considered? Or do you prefer the mystery unsolved, the question left open? Maybe you'll have trouble falling asleep tonight, thinking about Poe lying in that gutter outside Gunner's Hole, delirious and dying in someone else's clothes. Maybe you'll wonder about those lost days, about what horrors he experienced in his broken mind couldn't even articulate. Or maybe you'll sleep peacefully, comforted by the knowledge that even though Poe's life ended in mystery and pain, his work lives on, that beauty can come from suffering, that art can outlast the artist, that sometimes the questions are more important than the answers. Sweet dreams, and if you happen to hear a raven tapping at your window in the middle of the night, well, it's probably just the wind. Probably.